The next system we're going to cover is going to be the cardiovascular system. So there are three parts of the cardiovascular system. There's the blood, there's the heart, and then there are the blood vessels. Here are the objectives for the blood. We'll carry up to about here, up to here, and then this stuff will be in a second video, and we'll also review it in class. All right, so when we look at blood, there are two basic parts. Now what you do with blood, and let me show you a picture on the next slide. It's called a hematocrit. If you take a blood sample, you can do it by a finger and get it in a small tube, or you can get it like you donate blood. And what they can do then is take that blood and put it in a centrifuge. And a centrifuge is going to go around really, really fast, and it's going to separate the blood into its two basic component parts. The heavier part is going to sink to the bottom, and then the lighter part is going to come to the top. So down here are what are called the formed elements, and then this yellow part here is called the plasma. In between here, we'll talk about these are red blood cells. There's a layer right here of platelets and white blood cells that is called the Buffy coat. So let's come back to that in a second. So when we split the blood, you got the plasma. It is made mostly of water. This water is really important because with water it allows things to flow. So your blood can flow. The cells of the blood that we're going to talk about can flow through this water. If the water content goes down significantly, then it decreases flow, which we'll get into later. There's also a lot of proteins in the plasma that most are produced by the liver. Examples include albumin, globulin, and fibrinogen. Fibrinogen we will talk about. It helps your blood clot. And then globulins, you've probably heard of antibodies. That's just a more technical word for them. Now the formed elements, the three types of parts of cells. Erythrocytes or red blood cells are cells. Leukocytes or white blood cells are cells. But platelets are not. So that's why they're called formed elements and not just cells. So 95% of your formed elements, not 95% of the blood, but 95% of the formed elements are erythrocytes, erythro meaning red, cyte meaning blood. Cells, so red cells. What their job is to carry oxygen, and we'll get into that. Leukocytes are part of your immune system, and leuko means white, so white cells, and platelets, which are parts of cells, they're going to assist in the process of blood clotting. The white blood cells and the platelets make up 5% of the formed elements. So your erythrocytes are definitely the dominant formed element. So let's go to this next slide, which we already kind of did. So we do a hematocrit. So again, you take blood, you put it in the centrifuge. The formed elements are going to sink to the bottom. Since the red blood cells are the majority of formed elements, that's what you're going to see. Now, the white blood cells and the platelets would be a thin layer right above the red blood cells, between the red blood cells and the plasma, and that is called the Buffy coat. And they are such a small proportion of the total that they're hard to see. This is a slide representation if we did a blood smear. These large ones here are types of white blood cells. Here's the majority of your cells, which are erythrocytes, and then these small specks here, those are platelets. Okay, those are platelets. We're going to do case study with hematocrit and looking at blood doping and those kind of issues. So where do these cells come from? Where do the formed elements come from? They come from a stem cell that is located in your bone marrow, and that stem cell is called a hemocytoblast. A hemocytoblast. And what you see here is you see all these different pathways. One pathway leads to different types of white blood cells. We'll talk about some of these later. This pathway leads to platelets, and then this pathway leads to red blood cells. So depending on the protein signals that this blood stem cell is getting, it will go through all these pathways, but certain pathways will become dominant depending on the proteins that are prevalent in your system. So when you hear about adult stem cells, this is one example. They're rare, but they exist obviously in your bone marrow because that's how you're going to produce your blood cells. We're going to talk about the role that can play in the cancer of leukemia. So the pathway for red blood cells is here. Platelets is here. Notice the platelets here, they come from what's called a megakaryocyte. And what happens is the megakaryocyte, think of the megakaryocyte as a piece of paper, and then that paper ripped into little pieces, and those little pieces are the platelets. You'll also notice here that the technical name for platelets is thrombocytes. And then these are all examples of white blood cells. All right, so we're going to talk about the production of red blood cells. Poiesis means formation. Erythro is red. Red blood cells do not have a long lifespan. The reason they don't is because they do not have a nucleus, so they are kind of missing their brain. I want you to notice the shape. Okay, it's very concave. So look at how many are destroyed each second. But the good news is, in most cases, you make just as many each second. Okay. So a million and a trillion is a lot bigger, but a million is still a lot, okay? Especially if you think about each second that you're losing 2.5 million red blood cells. But again, on the good side, you're gaining 2.5 million. All right, so here's how red blood cells are made. This is what it looks like in words. I'll go through this with you and then I will show you a picture. Under the influence of a hormone called erythropoietin, shortened to EPO, that comes from the kidneys, the hemocytoblast will start producing erythroblasts. So that blood stem cell at the top of that picture, okay, at the top of that picture, under the influence of EPO, this pathway will start working at a higher rate, okay, at a higher rate. So EPO, remember that name, we will talk about it again. They will start stimulating that pathway. From a hemocytoblast, you're going to get what are called erythroblasts. Early erythroblasts will see a lot of ribosomes. Ribosomes, remember, produce proteins. The protein that they're going to produce is going to be hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is what carries oxygen, and these red blood cells are going to be oxygen-carrying machines. What a late erythroblast will do to make more space for more hemoglobin and also to allow the red blood cell, to have that shape that I showed you, it's going to actually get rid of the nucleus, and this is unique. Most cells have a nucleus. Red blood cells, mature red blood cells, do not. So then the ribosomes are going to continue to make more hemoglobin to fill that cell. Immature red blood cells are called reticulocytes. Mature red blood cells obviously are called red blood cells. You do have some reticulocytes in your bloodstream, about 2%. We'll talk about situations where you may have more and whether that's good or bad. So here's a picture of what I just went through. Here's your hemocytoblast going through the different stages. It's making hemoglobin. The ribosomes are making hemoglobins. We're still in the bone marrow here. It extrudes the nucleus. Here's a reticulocyte, and then you have a mature red blood cell, which is loaded with that hemoglobin. Okay, so we're going to do these questions in class. I want you to think about the question. If you need to stop the recording, do that and see if you can come up with an answer. But we'll do them in class. Okay, so now we're going to look at hemoglobin up close. The function of hemoglobin is to carry oxygen, and it's also to carry CO2. Here's an up close picture. The hemoglobin is made of 4 different proteins, okay, kind of curled together. In the center of each of those proteins is what's called a heme. Take this green part, blow it up, and oxygen can bind here to each of the hemes. Look at the heme up close, and what you will see is in the center you will see iron. This is why I had you learn that symbol, is iron. If iron is in the center of that heme, then the hemoglobin or the oxygen can bind to that heme. If the iron is missing, then oxygen cannot bind. So you hear about what's called iron deficient anemia. If you're missing, especially more prevalent in females, if you're missing the iron, you don't have enough iron in your system, then you will not be able to bind oxygen to hemoglobin. So you may have plenty of hemoglobin and plenty of red blood cells, but it will not bind. Sickle cell anemia, we'll talk about a little bit, is a genetic defect. It's more prevalent in African Americans of African American descent. What will happen is there's a defect in the hemoglobin, and so what will happen in low oxygen situations, the red blood cell, because the hemoglobin is not properly shaped, will change its shape into this sickle shape right here. See these? And what happens with these is they do not travel through the blood vessels correctly or efficiently, and they actually can block blood vessels. I'll tell you the story of Ryan Clark and the Pittsburgh Steelers. It's getting to be an old story now, it's been a while, but how sickle cell anemia indirectly caused the Broncos to beat the Steelers, which I did not like. So we'll come back to that. Okay, so here's another question that we will do in class, so you can look at it, see if you can answer it now. This question we're also going to do in class. This is not a question that you should know the answer to based on what I've told you, so you're just kind of make an educated guess, and then we will talk about it. We will also talk about this. So just look at these questions, and then we will go through them in lecture. Okay, so how do we recycle red blood cells? Because so many are made so quickly and so many are destroyed quickly, we don't want to waste everything. We don't want to just throw the whole red blood cell out. Okay, so what's going to happen is 10% of the red blood cells will be destroyed and secreted out. Your spleen will help with this. But 90% are going to be phagocytized, which means this. They're going to be engulfed by cells, white blood cells, and they're actually going to recycle the parts of the red blood cells. So just to give you an overview and make sure you're making some highlights here. So red blood cells are produced in the bone marrow. Okay. They do their thing and then they die. What's going to happen is the protein, which is the globin part of hemoglobin, the protein, the amino acids that make up the protein, are going to be recycled back into the bone marrow to be used again. Okay. The heme is going to be broken down, and some of that part of the heme can be recycled, actually cannot be recycled back into the body. So the protein will be, the heme cannot. And so what's going to happen is it's going to go into the liver. And in the liver, it's going to become biliverdin, which becomes bilirubin, and then bilirubin goes into the intestines, and then it's recycled. Okay, then it's recycled. So the heme part is not recycled. The iron is recycled, not all of it, but most of it. And the globin, the protein, is recycled. Again, the globin is recycled. The iron is recycled, but the heme is not. Now what happens is if the person's liver is not working, this can't happen. And so the bilirubin builds up in the person's system, and what you will see is you get what's called jaundice. And you'll see it, notice in her eye, in the whites of her eye, called the sclera, it's very yellow, and their skin can get yellow. It depends on the color of the person's skin. But this is what jaundice is. The liver's not working, and so that heme, that biliverdin, can't be released. It's not produced, and it builds up in the bloodstream. Your liver is a very large organ. And by the time you would get to the part, you can have a diseased liver for a long time and not know it. By the time you get to the point where you're jaundice, it can almost be too late to do anything. Now, babies, when they're first born, may sometimes be born jaundice, but that can usually be taken care of. It's just kind of getting their liver going, and they will usually, unless they do have a liver problem, they will usually survive that. Okay, this is about blood typing. We're not going to focus on that, so go back and review this. We'll go through and answer the questions that we did not answer, but kind of think about those few questions that were in this video. And that is the basics of blood, and specifically red blood cells.